As for sure, the red pan outside the window did not look like the battle fit. It was just a shadow quarter carved through, no in half and in parallel to a shadow-free line. The Germans had withdrawn from the top gulf, leaving behind a thin screen force to delay the American advance. You're hungry. You're hungry. You're always hungry. And yet for 2 days, no American man had crossed your life. Every attempt stalled at the same place, a 40-meter stretch of salt contract. When the earth dipped and the hedges rose high on both two sides, men stepped into it, believing they were protected, only to be cut down from angles they could not see. The fire never came from. It came from above and behind. Mr. Mosher realized this while counting bodies, not while reading a map. Mr. Mosher was a former civil engineer from Ohio. Mission complete, signed to the 36th Infantry Division as a training, non-commissioned officer. 1 first. Quiet staff holes meant to support others, not decide our place. His deal was try to have a house sugar of the spawn of it, which positions would hit him. He was not supposed to influence how it would hit him, but by the third morning, he could no longer bear the pattern. The Germans were not defending the rail track, they were using it. The embankment on each side were steep, reinforced by roots, and stone. Turn right on that position and start along the upper lip. Invisible from below is American infantry. Advance instinct. Push out into the half cover. 1 this side. Movement. Slow. They didn't know. And then the firing began. Angle down. Precise. Sure, nobody can now expose themselves. Men who say we're trapped. The real got fashioned by the phone. Artillery had been used. The shells shattered hedges of true earth. But the Germans simply pulled back from the lip off of the crater. When the barrage lifted, tanks could not depress their guns enough to reach the shooters above soaked ground. The nerve and its moisture bound the defenders. Each attempt ended the same way. By the afternoon of the second day, pins were refusing to advance in the dark, not out of fear, but recognition. They knew exactly what they wanted. User walked around alone that evening. He did not walk it by himself. He walked away. That was when he saw what everyone else would miss. Find the embankment running perpendicular to the rail line was a maintenance path, barely more than a scar in the prize. Dark earth. Before the war, by simple force, it was narrow, smooth, and hidden by brush. It did not lead to the American lines. He looked behind the drum. Firing positions. No map to mark it, no report to mention it. The drum is about to fire because it made no sense to unless someone noticed what the real trap actually did. The musket did not request a formal assault. He requested wire cutters. Before dawn, on the third day, Muslim men, mixed food of engineers, left the creek house long and made its path. They moved silently, stayed below the process horizon. The German was wrong with your neck, already firing the real time, already repeating what they looked. They did not look behind them. Murphy did not intend to invade directly. His plan was simple and more dangerous. He ordered the engineers to collapse the embankment. Paradise will be placed where most of the earth together, not when the soil is strongest, when the dead naked the ground, not for the hour. It gives me human life. And along the lip so earth disappeared beneath them. Some slid, some fell, some tried to run, but the mirror reached and protected them. Now we pray for them as a swimmer, a method of increasing your search into the real cut, not as partners, but as attackers. For the first time, fire from below the German position did not collapse because of casualties. It collapsed because of losses and advantage. The invader no longer controlled movement the forward. Within 10 minutes, the real attack was crushed. See, no self-respect. Make sure to not see the medal. This report was filed in the larger after-action summary describing all the last 3 next location. The Maiden's Path was never mentioned again, but no one knew. Survived that, crossing the last to be remembered. The Wade 1 giants had not been stronger. They had been positioned there. And once that position was distracted, the fight ended quickly, or often appears to be about firepower, numbers, and momentum. But at its core, it's about forcing movement and denying choice. The sign that depicts your decisions was made usually depicts how you end the real hacks. I see no is never meant to be a weapon, but someone usually got one and someone else learned how to take away. That is, how many battles end not with overwhelming force, but with a quiet realization that the world itself has changed sides. We're followed after the world has crashed, revealed how far the Germans are willing to go with this plan. Once the madman failed, there's nothing behind it. To show the effects, the German screen force had not been designed to hold parachute. It had been designed to control timber, to buy hours every day, and forcing the Americans to hesitate. When that hesitation vanished, the screen dissolved. Almost immediately, American units moved forward faster than their orders anticipated. How to become members of the Queen. Progress, they had no plan for supply. Trucks were attacked. They used the enemy clearing routes to become more impossible. I said 48 hours earlier, the bad seed reorganized itself and moved. The real guy lost his function. This is a pattern that appears again and again in warfare. That would be really neat positions do not mean a lot movement. They should expect the patient. When the patient breaks resistance, often collapses faster than planners believe possible. Germans along the rail track had not expected to be attacked from above and behind, because nothing in their experience suggested it would happen. Your defense assumed compliance, and soon the Americans will see terrible terror due to exist, and soon fear will form movement, and to put the blades, those assumptions have been corrected to the note. We will serve wrong and breaking the arrow. And we're not the one paper. He did not command a battalion. He did not command a first corps. He did not even engage the enemy directly in the traditional sense. His contribution was exceptional. He identified a relationship between training and behavior. That relationship mattered more than the number of rifles on either side. For 2 days, American infantry had behaved exactly as the Crown would have expected them to. They saw shelter where the earth met. They avoided exposed movement. They tried to power the earth, protective the humans. Explained that trust. When the environment collapsed, the earth evaporated. The rails no longer offer safety. The high ground no longer offers safety. Walls reverse, not because the order changed, but because the entry did. This distinction is important because it explains why firepower alone so often fails to resolve situations. Similarly, firepower applies pressure. Geometry determines outcome without changing the shape of the fire. Pressure merely prolongs it. Artillery did not break the wheel because artillery was strapped to the train. The tracks from above, then through the train, is very easy. Tanks did not break because tanks were not allowed to control and see through and bring it with us. We should not blame ourselves. He did not screw up on position, be invalidated. That is a subtle defense, but a decisive one. As they crossed the German prisoners, they described their surprise. They had believed the Americans were strong. They had seen the same movements repeated. They had seen more of the same before. When the ground gave way beneath them, the shock will not clear. With this belief is often final stage before collapse. Once this belief set in, cohesion becomes difficult to assure. Soldiers begin acting independently. Orders lose clarity. Trust in the environment erodes. A position once felt dominant becomes threatened. This psychological reversal shows no reason why breakthroughs often appear sudden, and harshly observers see only the moment of the lapse. At the start of the nation of South China, they planned to invade the British Crown. Hindus, trip sisters, building shipwrecks, force raids. These features all share a common nature with both sides of the William House function. One side gains control and fall. The fight becomes scripted. We should work this script. It depends on how I react to your thinking, but I plan a different discipline to it. And here's how to talk for low-pass ferrybots and unattended consequences. Sharshers do not fail everywhere else. They fail where sharshers concentrate. The invention was such a point, it cured the weight of the human defense. We failed everything. About the boss being this way of thinking is ultimately the organizations built to map repetition and standard position. All these rely on doctrine because doctrine creates coherence. But coherence can only into predictability, and Predictability invites explanation. The shards do not kill us, they are consistent. Consistency is powerful. Until the end, the aftermath is slow and it's as American forces pushed forward, German will go out to abandon several positions rather than risk isolation. We're about shocking moves in the background. We no longer have to send punishment engineers. We enforce real approaches that previously they ignored. Adaptation had begun, but too late for that sucker. This one is another uncomfortable truth. Learning in war is asymmetrical. One side learns from loss, the other learns from success. The cost of learning is rarely equal for the Americans. The whale cut became a last-year observation. For the Germans, it became a warning out of the confidence. But only one side benefited immediately. First returned to his bathroom the following week, his name not bearing headlines. His report was rejected. The meeting staff was overrun again with the monks. No mother indicates when the Batman class. Yet he said that moon people outward you begin. Paid closer attention to train features that did not appear in my original hands. Scouts were encouraged to look for paths that did not make sense. Engineers were consulted earlier not just for construction but for analysis. These were small changes, incremental, easy to overlook, but wars are often started by accumulations of small changes rather than singular mutations. The real part outside the glow matter because it demonstrates how quickly a diamond position and become irrelevant once its full information is realized. It showed that stalemates are rarely absolute. They persist only as long as the underlying assumptions remain intact. This lesson is uncomfortable because it implies that many prolonged battles could have been sooner if someone had asked a different question. But how do we push through this? End quote. But why? Are we moving this way at all? Part 2. That question threatens to establish rules, procedures, and hierarchies. In the event of uncertainty, it risks failure, yet refusing to ask it guarantees repetition. Mushroom asked it because he was not supposed to. His world placed him against the fight. Without being consumed by that distance, allowed him to see patterns of others that are full. To notice this dynamic appears repeatedly in history. Workers often come from the margins, people close enough to understand the problem, but distant enough to question. Its freedom, the royal fleet did, not fall because of heroism or superior firepower. It fell because someone recognized that the royal itself was doomed. Once that was understood, the solution was not dramatic, it was inevitable. And that is perhaps the most unsettling part of the story. The position is seen unworkable for 2 days today. The last 2 minutes, once the swatch was exposed, nothing appeared, changed. No new weapons arrived, no reinforcements picked. The balance-only understanding shifted. We are merely the worst of shapes, and all because the atoms are inside, but atoms surprise it inside and burst until it is forgotten. Again, somewhere else. Another world crumbles, another place where men will die doing exactly what the ground encourages them to do, until someone notices and asks a better question, and that question, once asked, has a wave effect, one far beyond the place that inspired it, more than ever since we fell, and the front went east. There isn't that crossing was trouble, to explain why it's there. With her, it was not the worst thing they saw. It was not the worst. No sins need short task for it. Yet it lingered because it revealed something unsettling about how close they'd come to sucking death at routine for 2 days. Men had danced into the rail car, knowing exactly what would happen. I died because orders said advance, because cover looked like cover, because stopping for worse than moving the ground itself that convinced them there is no alternative. That is the most dangerous kind of battlefield on that narrow imagination. When the investment collapsed and the board removed during fire, it widened the American sense of possibility. If that position could be undone, then others might be as well. The front was no longer a wall. It was a surface with seams. What do you see? Seams? You? To start looking for them everywhere. This is why Korean soldiers, you often discuss strong positions. Strength invites complacency. It seduces defenders into believing the fight has been solved, but have a sense of confidence and seek it for inactivity. The reactor was never inactivated, it was simply abandoned. Most of them never faded that way. Even years later, when asked about crossing, he would shrug and say the jumps of a pin position, and then forgotten why. He rarely mentioned his own rule. He understood that each life situation, even different, praying a different enemy, a different moment, the same idea might fail completely. But you know the man, too many losses from war are overgeneralized scripted contest, and believe in soldiers attack from the rear, exploit surprise, think outside the box. These phrases survive because they are easy to repeat, not because they are reliably useful. We'll say, no, actually demonstrated, was narrower and more demanding. It showed that every defense, the system rests on assumptions about human behavior. Those assumptions are rarely written down. They are embedded in earthworks, angles, ramps, and habits. Break the assumptions and the system falters. Miss them and you believe them indefinitely. This is not a call for constant deviation or reckless deviation. Most battles are won by disciplined execution of known methods. Boy, execution repeats without fact. Something deeper is wrong. The real problem was the belief that the fight had only one direction. Once that belief cracked, momentum returned, not because we are somehow bigger, stronger, or braver, but because they stopped cooperating with the crap that cooperation. This is often visible. Battlefields shape behavior subtly. Soldiers follow paths of least resistance. They seek cover where they are safest. They align movement with terrain because terrain provides evasion. Defenders rely on this. They depend on instinct and intuition to avoid it. The Germans' tunnel were not cruel or foolish. They were hunted. They defended the route precisely because of the line with how people move under fire, until it didn't when the attack gave way. Instead, they betrayed them. The same slopes that had protected them now destabilized them. The same hatred for concealment became a closure. The ground flipped the limits. Without warning, this inversion is rare, and it's so shocking when it happens that time it has to occur across wars. It happened in the ruins of Stonehenge. A fat priest became footloose until suitors swayed the braves. It happened in the Temple of the Pacific. The reef line is dominated until bypassed by the sea. It happened in cities or streets full, and the walls were breached through and through. Each time, the lesson was the same. People are fragile. When it depends on expectation, the fatality is that this fatality is often discovered only after unnecessary loss. Soldiers die or are wounded or seen sooner at the battle lab or in the breach of the Western Front. Worcester's position on the war games gave him that freedom. He was crossing the sea, close, distant enough to challenge the pattern that domination is rare, they cannot be manufactured easily. Which is why stories like this matter, not because they glorify cleverness, but because they expose how easily the mistake can do it. For the ability, how quickly repetition becomes habit, how quietly habit becomes awkward. The rail track line signal is marked. Now trees that were planted that line, grass would blatantly invade it to anyone passing through. It looks like an unremarkable fold in the countryside, but for a brief moment in 1944, it was a machine that turned obedience into death. And there wasn't. The difference was not steel or fire, it was attention. What? We know about the dog before and it won't show, and it's 5 and 10 feet. That is not a miracle. It is a reminder the world does not reward those who see the most danger. It rewards those who see the trash behind it and are willing to act before reputation hardens the faith. The danger, of course, is that the reminders and look past in the football people in France's shadow became best known as a long whistle player. Passed through, far over, and left behind. New battles demand attention, new bosses demand explanation. The real truth slipped into memory, carried only by the men who'd felt its pull and then felt it break. This is how war preserves lessons selectively. What is dramatic is remembered, what is instructive is archived. The class of the event was not dramatic enough to become legit. There was no last stand, no heroic charge, no cinematic resolution, just a sudden end to the fire. The fire had always been for those who study war, that absence is often the most important signal, but it is also the easiest to overlook. Silence rarely demands an explanation, yet silence is often the moment when a system has failed. German defense of Stalingrad did not end because it was destroyed. It ended because it no longer made sense once the world had stopped shipping mail and movement its reason to exist. The defenders were not allowed. They were displaced conceptually before they were physically. That's all that matters most. Military failures are conceptual before they are material. Forces can last only after the placed ideas holding them together stop functioning. Weapons need power, and the world falls apart. This is what the most dangerous question on any battlefield is. Not where is the enemy, but why are we standing here? Looks like Kant asked that question without realizing how weird it was. He did not frame his exciting grand plans. He did not believe he had outthought the government. He simply noticed that the same action kept producing the same result, and that the result did not benefit his side. The operation, the noise, and sounds is often suppressed in non-pressure environments where deviation feels irresponsible, repetition feels safe, it feels professional, it feels sensible, and it cures people the real touch of men, not because it was well defended, but because everyone agrees silently on how should be agreement created. Predictability created lethality. When the agreement dissolved, so did the position. This battle reappears. In every era of warfare, crusaders give way to barbarians. Barbarians divide cities. Cities divide nations each time. Defenders know the system. They assume attackers will behave rationally according to past behavior. Each time attackers suffer until someone stops behaving as expected. The last is not to always be unconditional. The last is to recognize when the nation has stopped working. St. Louis did not require brilliance. It required honesty. The honesty to admit that courage and persistence would be spent on the wrong problem. Once that admission was made, the solution followed naturally from the problem itself. The ground had always offered another way, knowing the bigger. That is why the story endures quietly. We have ominous reminders attached. It does not flatter. It does not comfort. It does not promise that thinking differently will always save lives. It only suggests that failing to think differently will almost certainly cost them in the end. A real fix seems to be a warning rather than an instruction. A warning about what happens when terrain, habit, and the beings align too perfectly. A warning about how easily humans can to cooperate with their own destruction when the environment tells them there is no alternative. In the mind of the most dangerous trap are not the ones hidden from view, but the ones everyone sees and accepts. Somewhere, in every conflict, there is another way of peace. In every war street, a bridge, a river, a feature, and go by there until someone asks, why not, how, to push harder. But why do you push them? The question is not end wars, but it is certain kinds of death, and sometimes that is the difference between a battlefield and a cemetery. And one of the final differences, when the real truth is silent. No one announces it, no simple fear, no shadow of a doubt move that much forward, and then closest to it move this first, because something that had always been there was suddenly gone. The start of a short, disciplined journey was always vision, always timed, simply stopped at first, no question, time on the get. The battlefield is really useful. It can mean preparation, it can mean bait. It can mean a mistake that will be punished moments from now. For several minutes, American infantry would stay where they were, waiting for the familiar Russian to arrive. It didn't only then did movement begin, not as an assault but as a test. A single squad inch forward, then another. Boots crossed the same patch of ground where bodies were lying for 2 days, and nothing happened. New crossfire, new animal cross for the environment. The real threat, which had functioned like an impeccable device, no longer responded. That the moment mattered more than the collapse itself. What broke it, said no, was not building resistance. It was expectation. For 48 hours, expectation of gallant behavior on both sides. The Americans moved forward into the tank. The Americans expected to be punished by the day. Both expectations reinforced to each other. That mutual reinforcement created stability and deadly pride. The Enlightenment was not just earth and roots, it was, and green. Once that green ended, the battlefield reorganized faster than anyone had planned for the few leaders of the roots. Without waste of a big mess, engineers widen paths and dig more runners, carried messages that seemed forward. Movement, instead of the way, this is how most battles actually. Not through overpowering force, but through some elements were unspotted. The human delay line down. The world cut had never been met to fit and bend it. It relied on the cut to slow and shape the events. Without it, the remaining positions were exposed, unprepared, and psychologically unhinged. Prisoners had to labor that day to finish. They spoke less about surprise and more about confusion. They expected to be noticed and attacked again from the front. They expected artillery. They had expected repetition. What they did not expect was silence behind them. Confusion is often misunderstood as fear. It's not the same. Fear sharpens confusion, dissolves. When soldiers no longer understand the relationship between pain, threat, and safety, discipline loses its anchor. That is, what happened along the invasion. The Germans did not retreat because they were overwhelmed. They withdrew because the position no longer held them up to do. The ground no longer instruct the behavior. Once that happens, cohesion becomes fragile, even among experienced humans. This distinction matters because we, friends, how battles end, we tend to imagine resistance fractures under pressure. In reality, it fractures when meaning collapses, when positions stop making sense, it stops being held. Motion never articulated it this way. He did not have to. He saw the effect, not the theory. The embankment had to take it movement. He removed that depression. Everything else followed. The irony is that nothing about the real God was been hidden. It was visible to anyone with a map and a pair of eyes. What had been hidden was its function. This is the danger of familiarity. When a feature is always present, it stops being questioned. With losses repeat, they are normalized. The real tough transition from obstacle to an ability in less than 2 days. That transition is deadly. It happens when commander be hit by an arrow, losses instead of questioning causes with phrases like acceptable penalties and unnecessary pressure. Replace analysis when repetition be house. Professionalism. St. Louis was moved to Portland, Oregon. The environment was not the best for a man. It was plainly in order to die there. We should be ready to get ready, not in fine orders openly, but by acting in a space. The order did not consider the amendments have existed outside the formal, the structure of the plan. It gave him freedom. It also gave him responsibility. Responsibility is opposed to inside, and the amendment collapse failed, and German reserves responded faster, and the Americans been humble attacked in the World Cup itself. Most of us actually would have remembered very differently at all. That risk was real. Fight does not guarantee success, but repetition guaranteed failure. This is the uncomfortable truth of the simple. The story St. Louis did not demand heroism. It demanded refusal. Refused to accept that the fight had only one direction. Refused to retreat in the text section. Static refusal to confuse persistence with progress. Once that refusal occurred, fight it quickly. And that is what made it dangerous, because it suggested that many deaths had not been inevitable. They had been the product of grievance, sorrow, and lament. And leave it at first level. No formal instructions. Issued no directives. Circulated, instructing officers to fake life engineers or attack assumptions. Aries do not function that way. They absorb change gradually, unevenly, and often without recognition. But the shift hadn't ended. It showed up first, and how skills were used, controls began ranging. Wider, not just forward, engineers were asked about training. Before assault, not after officers began asking where the enemy wasn't. Not just where he was, these were smaller gestures, but smaller gestures compound. The German army noticed them too. They were eager, and they were listening positions that have been left lightly guarded on the assumption that they were irrelevant. begin receiving attention when approaches were made overnight, as for what we had once imagined became contested. This adaptation illustrates a key principle of warfare advantage, is temporary not because the enemy are stupid, but because winning is inevitable. That's why the one faster pays less for it. Say no to the Germans' position. It cost the Americans time and lives. Both sides hurt, only one side profited from the lesson. These aces, please don't misunderstand. We imagine both sides running equally from bro. Battle, maybe not earning, is filtered by success and failure. Victims often misattribute why they won. The victors are often overrated. The Americans could form great empires. Out of curiosity, the Germans could not yet. Even on the American side, the victors remained fragile. It is easier to remember techniques and principles. Use them in your creatively exploit new approaches. Collapse today. These phrases are actionable. They are also incomplete. The real lesson is not about what we should do, but why it worked. It worked because the true defense of any unpredictable human behavior. It worked because the environment controlled them rather than the bot. It worked because the environment had been cooperating with the trap without realizing it, missed that, and the situation becomes dangerous. This is how metal sick. Hey, it is not soldiers divorced from context officers that we create outcomes rather than understand relationships. The natural dynamics differ. The same rule fails. Bosses resume. Same rule. Warned against that kind of thinking. The story is not an argument for clarity. It is important for attention. Attention to repetition. Attention patterns of loss. Attention places where effort does not change outcome. This is a signal that something structural is wrong. Most of the positions will be automatically scripted to act out sexual violence because they threaten the enemy, and when the positions slide by the quickest, decisions were wrong. And I scripted it just as I wrote it, and more that destruction feels dangerous, but more it's often worse. The rail cut became lethal because it went unchallenged long enough to become routine. Routine kills faster than surprise. Horses actually did not break down in discipline, it broke routine. That distinction matters because it explains why the fight ended so abruptly. Once routine failed, the Germans were forced into improvisation. Improvisation favors the attacker, not the defender. Defense thrives on preparation, attack thrives on destruction, but for acting in the bank, the usher informed the balance. He forced the defenders into reaction while attackers would gain initiative. Initiative is not important. It is choice. For 2 days, the American had none. They could dance or wait, both LED to the same outcome. After leaving, the class copies multiply. Which one decisions matter? Again, this restored agency is often seen from around it. It is not emotional. It is a chemical. Soldiers move differently when the bleed. Movement matters. You cross the road, but that truck's flaps will not break the motion banner earlier. They are simply no longer trapped by the law of physics. They cannot control. That is a hard fifth truth. That because it suggests that breathing alone is insufficient without understanding first, becomes fuel for someone else's system. The German defensive Samoa was affected because it turned American forces into predictability. This refinement, as in locations far beyond London, every conflict faces a violence that shall be here. Streets, valleys, quarters, procedures, change of command. Once the enemy becomes predictable, it can be exploited. Once exploited, also repeat. The solution is not possible invasion. It is intermittent question. Why here? Why this route? Why does the enemy seem comfortable with this battle? Both factions are uncomfortable. A slow action to create friction inside organizations already under stress, but without them, friction simply appears elsewhere on the battlefield. Pay in blood. Sing Lo is remembered not because it was large, but because it was clear. It showed how quickly a stalemate can evaporate once its hidden water is exposed. That clarity is rare. It deserves to attention. The violation of treaties, like Sing Lo, is misunderstanding what they asked of us. They do not ask for constant obedience in doctrine. Doctrine exists for a reason. Most of the time, it works better than improvisation. Discipline, coordination, and repetition are the foundations of military effectiveness. But doctrine is a tool, Madeline, when, through the only way to see the battlefield, it becomes a liability. So now, if you don't happen from after Blind's operation, the murders were doing what Gafford described. The Romans were doing what Dr. Prescott Family Matters, using terrain to amplify fire. Both sides were threatened. That's why the fight-sold sailors have heard of both sides of the threat within the same frame. But King's stalemate requires breaking the frame. Morsel did not describe back to him. He apologized and chased it through. He did not carry out orders. He explained that the orders did not agree that. Nuance matters. It shows that adaptation does not require chaos. It requires stability in the edges. Organizations that don't need a lot of money and pursue efficiency often don't need accountability. This is a recurring failure of cross-world institutions. The meeting's path behind the bank would exist because no one thought it mattered that blank created. Opportunity, in modern terms, we call it a blind spot. Blind spots are not errors. They are the inevitable result of focus. Wherever a patient contemplates, something else fades. A factor adversary operate in that field. St. Louis was not about seeing more. It was about seeing differently. This distinction is crucial as warfare becomes more and more automated. Sensors, maps, and feeds promise comprehensive awareness. They rarely deliver understanding. They have features, not functions. The real pedo maps is ruled to not understanding, requires synthesis and inquiry, behavior repetition and output. That synthesis do not be operated, judgment, experience, and sometimes intuition from outside knowledge and culture, which is engineer background matter because engineers are trained to think about unintended consequences. Structures fail in ways desired to not anticipate. Trend is normally this work effectively makes valuable precisely because it resists new sleepers. Lesson is not that engineers should be infantry. It is that certain things matter in environments where human behavior is shaped by physical constraints. War is such an environment in paper-shaped behavior. Behavior should loss, should decision, and fight movement in the machine. And your opponents, that pain is never done. Sometimes it is visible. Often it's not. The shots will be here. Any level is to look for. Not once, repeatedly, because the moment you start questioning why something works is the moment it begins to work against you. St. Law offers no guarantee that intent will arrive in time. It does not promise that attention will be rewarded. This is what happens when you die, because no one questioned the whether men live. Because one person finally did that is not more destruction. It is a scripture of war. War is not fair. It does not distribute consequences evenly. It pushes violence when it bounces. The world has gone. Now in big man's class, the big man's path is invisible somewhere else. Another position waits not, because it's strong, but because it is accepted until it isn't. And when that moment comes, the fight will begin quietly, not a noise, but a silence. Silence, beware. It's really in the sword, and laughter is the pause that allows all heaven to return at the same low the American advance did. Not suddenly become brave inside an adaptation. For every whale that was questioned, there were 10 others that were accepted without thought. For every position broken by understanding, there were many more reduced by force. Friction and time war does not transform institutions overnight. It climbs in forward unevenly, listen by listen, loss by loss. This is why the deep beliefs say no is not found in what changed afterward, but in what did not. Doctrine were made, hierarchies were made, procedures were made. The same animals were still part, the same phrases appeared in reports, and the resistance different, providing favor than finger pressure were required. These words persisted because they were safe. They expressed failure without demanding uncomfortable introspection. What seemed like a quiet dementia was the brain's attempt to favor anger, training only the worst of us, to understand how it shapes behavior. The impact, not favor the Jones. Favor predictability. Once predictability disappeared, so did its power. This distinction matters because it shifts responsibility away from fate and toward perception. Saying the terrain fate of the enemy implies inevitability. Saying the terrain shape our behavior implies choice. Choice is frightening. In war, choice means responsibility. It is far easier to accept loss is unavoidable, that even from the possibility that resulting from unexamined assumptions, this is why institutional learning is slow. Systems protect themselves from guilt by framing outcomes as a product of external forces rather than internal blindness. Say no to that comfort. If I overlook weapons that can undo a position that killed dozens of men, then what else have they overlooked? What other deaths have they quietly authorized by habit rather than necessity? These questions do not make good after-action summaries. They make uncomfortable ones. So the story seems to survive, mostly in fragments, in personal memory, in quiet conversations, in the changed behavior of officers who would been there. The influence practice more than policy. It shaped intuition more than background. That is often how mission for mission travel, not for formal instruction, but for a shift. You have experienced before an officer who had seen Sadler. He would walk around differently. He would spend more time looking where the enemy was not. He would grow suspicious of positions that seemed to affect him for too long. He would question why a task kept failing in the same way. None of this would appear in his orders, but he would check them. This is the invisible way, to see battles that are not named after victories or defeats, but after realizations. Signal is not a revelation to everyone. Many pass through without noticing anything unusual, but for those who did notice, it altered the way war looked. The battlefield started being fought in private. It became a system. Systems behave differently. The obvious, you cannot defeat them by hitting the harder in the same place you defeat them, by disrupting the relationships that hold them here. That disruption often occurs at points that appear insignificant until they fail. The World Cup was such a bomb. So was the French Hill. So was the new house in Sydney. So was the white people's white lines. So assumptions about human behavior under fire. What pressures those who seek surfaces for structures? It rewards those who understand how. Structures die action. This understanding does not guarantee success. It only changes the odds. May who understand still die. May who do not still survive. War is indifferent to dance life. It's not select for wisdom, it's select for outcomes. But insight changes which outcomes are possible. Except no insight made movement possible where only death existed. Before that alone justifies its past. The danger of forgetting the second side is always fragile. It rots when conditions change. It falls when successfully enforced confidence. It disappears when new technology comes, and certainty, every generation believes it has escaped the limitations of the last. Every generation discovers new ways to repeat the same errors. The real part is a reminder that the battlefield always depends more than we see somewhere. Even now, there is another position that works not because it is strong, but because it is accepted. Another pattern, flaws that feels uncomfortable. Another place for many events because something feels worse, not because it makes sense, is somewhere nearby. There's a feature known as a path, a gap, a margin. The difference between those two places is not measured in meters or firepower. It is measured in attention. Franco did not win the war. It did not win. It did not produce a doctor. It did something quieter and more dangerous. It proved that inevitability is often an illusion. The most sad illusion breaks the ground, self, and change signs.